Hi, good afternoon, good morning, depending on what time you're looking at this video. And welcome so much to our conversation that's focusing around coaching students through challenges. This is an asynchronous opportunity for you to engage with Ben and myself around how do you grow students' thinking and their capacity as they're navigating something that is challenging, that definitely requires a level of persistence, as well as really growing their capacity to engage in self-direction. So if you're trying to take a look at the resources that we have, the landing page actually includes everything that Ben and I have been doing in terms of our 3 sessions, a couple sessions Ben is doing by herself, as well as sessions that Heidi and I are doing, all on this one landing page. So as you're starting to navigate your way there, you'll see that this link to the Zoom recording, it's not here yet because we're doing that right now live, as well as the slides, they will be right here for your viewing pleasure, as well as other resources. For example, the instructional ideas for the Learning Pit, which you'll find out a little bit more about in our presentation, as well as an example of what students and a teacher have created as a way of persisting in a math class. So all of your resources are right here that you can continue to revisit both during the session and after the session is over. So with that, we want to get started. So here is the slide deck. I am going to be in presenting mode and officially turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Ben Acalik.
Well, good day to you all, and it's a pleasure to be with you. We know that not only are the students making their way through challenges, but we are also, and it's been quite a ride. So I think that what we're interested in doing now is really saying something about that, which is as we're coaching students through challenges, we can also keep remembering the many challenges that we've been facing and be self-observing. Ask ourselves, what were some of those challenges and how were we responding to them? Because now more than ever, we probably have a very deep identification and empathy for what students go through when they're thrown into new learning situations that they've never been in before. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to use the Learning Pit, and we're going to share with you what that is, but how to use the Learning Pit as an image, as a way to provide language and strategies for addressing the phases of working through difficult problems. And I will suggest to you that it's very likely we all fell into the pit when we were challenged to start with our triage on how we're going to manage remote learning. And then to integrate the habits of mind, being mindful of the fact that the habits of mind are not something that live outside of where we work, but they stay inside all of the work that we do, social, emotional, cognitive. And that finally, we'll create a draft in which we can see what are some of the possible strategies that we can use to foster self-management when we're confronted with challenges.
So let's take a look and visualize the power of the Learning Pit. This is an illustration that really immediately resonates, not just with Ben and myself, but we shared this with hundreds of teachers to really think through what is the reality as you're moving through the Learning Pit. So let's just take a quick look at this first, just to get you oriented to it. So when you're looking at the left side, that kind of grassy area with the learning, with the arrow down below, all learning does require us to move through a learning pit, whether it's a little divot or it feels like the Grand Canyon. The intention of really trying to think through that learning does require a level of problem solving and failure, and the opportunity of really trying to think through, are we designing a learning experience that does create a level of cognitive dissonance for the student so that they can begin to start getting intrigued or excited about what their learning experience is along the way. But as you're starting to think about the other side of the learning pit, the other right side with the grassy knoll, notice that it's higher than the left side. The intention is that when you're moving through the learning pit and you come out on the other side, you actually are wiser, more skillful, more sophisticated than you were when you started the journey. And the intention here is that we want to make sure that we're growing students' capacity to continue to learn by doing, to continue to learn by the false starts and the missteps, so that they can feel more confident and capable and actually a little more excited and energized by problems and challenges and texts and tasks that they're asked to do that they don't quite know how to actually make sense of it when they start with. When you're also taking a look at the learning pit, notice what it feels like to be on the bottom. In this particular case, when you're at the bottom of the learning pit, the little thought bubble is, I'm confused. You can also imagine other thought bubbles that you might have. I'm thinking about my own two children when they're sort of imagining themselves in the learning pit. And my kids have two very different reactions when they feel really stuck. My son has a mentality of anxiety and worry and frustration. And then my daughter, when she's at the bottom of the learning pit, she starts to actually get excited because this is an opportunity that actually energizes her. So the interesting dynamic of starting to think about how you're navigating through the learning pit, to start to think about your own thought bubbles, whether you were using this when you were in your first couple weeks of the remote learning experience and that learning pit, or if you want to run away from that for a minute and think about something that you actually volunteered for, something like running a 5K when you are not really a runner, or learning how to play a new musical instrument. So take a beat, take a few minutes, and actually consider what it's like to move through the learning pit from your personal perspective. And what does it feel like to climb out? And then we want to give you an opportunity to read what the collection of other adults are saying as well. So about 5 minutes, and then we'll get started again.
So when we're thinking, excuse me, when we're thinking about the learning pit and we're trying to think about which habits of mind, we might not have been conscious of it. We might not have been saying, oh, well, this is the habit of mind I'm using now. But that consciousness of it is because we do it so automatically. But when we're stuck and we don't know that we're doing it, naming it is really, really helpful. The same as when we talk about our emotional life, we have a language for, or we're learning all the more, a language for when I feel sad, when I feel frustrated, when I feel like I can't do this. So what are we thinking about when we're in the learning pit and we're actually asking ourselves, what are those little bubbles inside the head? So if we look at it, we can look again at the learning pit and we can ask ourselves, could you just show the bubbles for the learning pit, please? Thanks. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So if we were saying to ourselves, for example, when I'm right there at the edge in the little grassy knoll, so let's walk it through from a habits of mind perspective. I would say sometimes for me personally, I am often thinking, I am going to take a responsible risk. I am really going to try this, even though I know it may be difficult. Woo, I start to slide in. I find that it's difficult. I could easily give up because why did I say I would do this in the first place? But instead I say, I'm going to be persisting. Darn it, I'm going to make this work. And as I start to slide down, I find this little backpack of habits of mind. So now if you could go back to that slide, the slide on the habits of mind again, and I could say, oh, this little backpack, where in this backpack could I name a habit that would really help me right now? I'm going to persist. I'm willing to do that. Oh, I think I could be thinking flexibly. If I were thinking flexibly, maybe I'd find some alternatives, some ways that I could actually begin to try different strategies. And as I climb my way out of the pit, I find that I'm on a higher level because I've learned something. I've actually used some of the habits of mind, and they've helped me to climb my way out. And when I get to the top, when I'm out of the pit, I am responding with wonderment and awe. Well, I got it done. By golly, it's terrific. So now, why don't you go back to your chat and think about which of the habits of mind might you consciously name based on what you described was your slide into the pit and out of the pit. And just think about that so you begin to attach the language of the habits of mind to your beginning to see how you struggle and what you do when you're just not sure what to do, where the habits of mind become a backpack of language and tools for you to consider.
So about 5 minutes again, and we'll see you back here when you're ready to continue.
So when we're personalizing learning with habits of mind, when we're saying that the two really go together, and they go together because it's really important to remember that personalizing means you're really considering your relationship with the person, that you're really concerned and you're responsive, and that you're suggesting that I really care about each individual, that's personalizing, and at the same time, I care about the fact that you become an effective, good thinker, because if you can become a good thinker, if you can really learn how to apply what you're learning in a variety of situations, then you're more likely to actually become a more whole person, both in school, outside of school, and in life wherever it takes you. So the first that we talk about is voice. Really learning how to become an advocate for your own thinking, increasingly being more open to sharing your learning, being willing to take the chances that it takes to actually use your voice to advocate for your ideas and your thinking.
Co-creation is really about not only articulating the challenge, which is part of voice, but also feeling like you have an opportunity to engage with the teacher or with students, or actually troubleshooting your own thinking by co-creating and developing a strategy, an approach, an idea, and sharing that with others to continue as we move into social construction on learning from one another's processing, from other people's strategies or approaches, similar to what you were doing in the chat room a minute ago when you started to read what other people had started to identify when it comes to the thought bubbles of what is it like to feel at the bottom of the pit versus the idea of how might we start to think about the differences between which habits were associated with the sliding down to the bottom, or being on the bottom, or actually starting to move your way back up. So that's the intention of co-creation and social construction, and they feed on one another. So the intention of growing students' capacity to not only develop ideas, but to share those ideas lead into self-discovery. Benna?
And finally, we talk about, not finally, because these aren't in any order really, but we are talking about this whole process as being one of self-discovery. What am I finding out about myself as a learner? How do I reflect on what I'm learning? As I've gone through advocating, or maybe co-creating, or maybe social construction, all of it, we're asking, how do you keep reflecting upon that and saying, whoa, who am I becoming? How am I becoming a learner and a player in this whole world, in which all the world might be full of learning opportunities? So to go for a deeper dive in each, the first I'm going to look at is growing voice. And let's just ask ourselves, how do we really develop the courage to express our needs without fear of public embarrassment? How do we make sure that we're willing to say what's on our minds, even if we're not sure it's right, or even if we're not sure if anybody agrees with us? It's entirely possible not to. So what do we do? How do we make sure that we're creating an environment in learning? And I think this is even more difficult when we're in our remote environments, where we really don't get some of the same cues that we might get in the classroom, for example. And that has both positive and negative. We've heard students who have said, you know, I really share my ideas and am more open with my ideas when I'm working in the remote environment, because I can't see anybody rolling their eyes or saying, oh my, what is she saying now? So I feel a little more confident that I can express myself. On the other hand, other students are saying, I really need to get the body language, the shaking of heads, the feeling that you're really listening. So we have to be very aware of this and encourage our students, regardless of whether they're in school or not, that this is a matter of respecting one another's voices and really listening with understanding and empathy.
And I'm going to do co-creation and social construction, but before we do that, I want to give you clarity that these prompts are also something that you can continue to revisit, not just in the slide deck, but also at the bottom of the session. You'll see coaching prompts that these are also indicated in. So the next part really is co-creation, as we suggested, and the opportunity to think about the role students have in developing their learning. So the interesting part of this exploration is starting to get students to see that they have a seat at the design table. So on some level, they can begin to think through and figure out how to make their way out of the learning pit. What kinds of strategies and ideas can they pursue? What kinds of questions might they have to continue to investigate and explore? I think another aspect of co-creation is really starting to give students a gauge in how to move through and monitor progress in relation to their goal. Even giving them the learning pit in and of itself is an incredibly helpful way for students to begin to show you where I am in the learning experience. And again, on the landing page, you'll see instructional ideas around the learning pit. And we found, based on sharing this with many school districts, as early as first grade, for example, can really continue to take on the idea of the illustration and begin to clarify and describe, even when they're having like little avatars or photos of themselves, to actually show you where they are in the learning pit, to continue to help you gauge what they potentially might need, what kinds of questions you might ask, and how you can continue to celebrate every step of the journey along the way, as opposed to only celebrate when they get to the other side. So the next part is thinking through what a concrete example of what that might look like. So when I presented this to a high school class, as they started to understand and appreciate the learning pit, after about 10 minutes of conversation, they came up with guidelines that they wanted to tell their classroom teacher and what they needed when they were moving through the learning pit. So for example, the students were saying to the classroom teacher, can you share with us what some good examples are for this particular assignment or project, so that we can study them in advance and engage in conversations, not just with you, the classroom teacher, but with one another. Another example of, it was so lovely, that's why I took a snapshot of the board, have consistency and devotion. So the notion of that level of persisting, but the opportunity to continue to make it so that I feel connected and committed to the work. So I want you, my classroom teacher, to mirror that for me and with me, because sometimes I need a little injection of passion and sometimes I need a little drumbeat on how's it going? How's it going? And so I think the idea of navigating between those two, again, this was the wisdom of a group of high school students, but it was so lovely the photo was taken rather than turning it into a slide. So social construction. Bennett, did you want to say something about that?
And I was just going to say that it really shows you how much this can mean, even when you're not with them, what
Yes,
they're looking for. Because this is really what they're looking for is your feedback, your constant both encouragement and your feedback. And I
absolutely.
think sometimes when we got so dumped into this remote learning, we forgot the significance of their need for connection, to really have connection about the work they're doing, not so much just the relationship, which is clearly important, but they really want to make sure that they're getting connection to the work that they're doing and how you're perceiving it.
Well, and it's so incredibly important, Benna, because when we're starting to think about the significance of feedback, the idea of that they want critique, if we only focus on what they have in that top part of their second column, managing short-term actions and time, rather than being connected to the opening to critique, it starts to make students feel like they're sort of on like in a hamster wheel, for example, where they're constantly doing assignment after assignment that are not necessarily growing from the experience. And so when you're really moving into the idea of opening them up to critiquing, you're starting to also build the connection around social construction, because you don't have to be the only one to engage in that level of critique. So from social construction, we really do want students to engage with one another around seeking out, how did you get yourself unstuck? How can I get better on this particular prototype that I'm engaged with? In my writing, can you give me an insight into how I can write a stronger thesis statement, for example? So these are the ways of continuing to engage students in reflective prompts around social construction. The opportunity to engage others outside the classroom. And right now, you're in this magical space. We didn't ask for it, but at the same time, they're at home. They're surrounded by adults that they typically didn't have access to. But they're also more inclined to engage with others, whether it's through chat or other social media platforms to connect with one another, kid to kid, but also continuing to leverage outside expertise in potentially the guest speakers that you bring virtually, as well as other connections they have outside of class. So this is one more concrete example that we wanted to share, the flow chart for persisting. This was developed by a secondary math teacher and her students. And again, if this visual is a little too small for you to read, this also is on the landing page that I shared with you at the beginning of the presentation, so that you can begin to start to think through, how do you grow students' capacity as they persist? So this particular flow chart in the circles and the arrows, as you continue to study it, especially when you're thinking about the impact when students are part of the design and the creation of this, they can begin to think through how they are moving through the experience. So if I'm starting here, what's the problem asking? I don't know, go back to the beginning. That's the opportunity, the playfulness, as well as the social construction of, it doesn't necessarily need to be from one to the next to the next. There is this level of misery sometimes, like, what's my plan and how is it working? Stuck, go back here. So the intention of that level of interplay, that's the kind of magic that can come when you're engaging in this conversation with students as they're drafting this. Benna?
So then we talk about self-discovery, because as you're making your way through all of this, here you are, you're down in the pit. And you know, the really interesting thing is, if you look at that diagram, which I'm sure you'll get to see a couple of times, when you come out from the learning pit, you're at a higher level than when you went in. If you find you're on the same level, it didn't happen. The learning was really pretty much, you were in the pit, things were happening, but you weren't really changing. So it gives you a chance to reflect back and look at this question. First of all, where am I now? Have I really succeeded? What are some of the things that I learned as I looked and saw what I was doing? Were there places where I could have done things differently? Were there things where I could have been more efficient? What am I learning about myself as a learner? And growing self-discovery is really one of the things that people keep saying to us. We are amazed at how important that is and how much we tend to overlook it, because it's really where we're asking our students to, not for us externally to tell them, but for them to keep narrating and telling themselves, here's where you are in your learning. Here's what you really are paying attention to. That's something that I need to, as a learner, begin to notice within myself. So we're taking a good look at how we grow as learners when we're discovering ourselves. So here's an example of a student where he was really reflecting on this. And in this particular school, and by the way, it's in Cambodia, which is kind of interesting, but they use the habits of mind and personalized learning. And what they were saying here is that they asked the students to reflect on which habit were you using and show evidence of where and how you were using it. So see this sample reflection from the student, and I'll just point out to you that notice where he's saying right here that the lost boy of Sudan thinks that they are still continuing to eat food. And then notice if I go down here, they find the solution by looking at it in other ways. So notice he's beginning to see that. He's thinking flexibly.
So as we move into the next challenge, trying to figure out how to grow your students, grow their thinking, their agency throughout this, we invite you to visit the Google Doc. So we're gonna do that right now to think through these ideas with your colleagues. So as you start seeing this link come up on the screen, the intention of really trying to get you to see the synergy between the 4 attributes and the learning pit. So first, as you're identifying your small teams, again, we recommend about 3 to 6 people in a group. You're going to look at the learning pit and start to begin to imagine from a student's point of view, how might your learners feel? What are their thought bubbles? And again, you can begin to use your own learning experience as a guide. We also wanted to get you that visual access to the 4 attributes of personalized learning. So that's true for the second question or challenge that we have, of now starting to connect those 4 attributes of personalized learning to the conversation. And the idea here is trying to think about the learning pit, navigating through the learning pit through the lens of coaching questions. And we divided it up into 2 territories. One are questions that teachers can pose to students so that the students can continue to benefit from that interaction, from that prompting. And the second part are questions that the students can ask themselves. Now, keep in mind that you're doing this on the student's behalf, and you're trying to model this with them if you want to make this learning pit visible in the beginning of the year. At the same time, as students become more comfortable, not just with the visual, but the experience of feeling like not only can they sort of move through the learning pit, but benefit from being out on the other side of it, looking back and reflecting on things. And so continuing to share concrete examples, whether you want to do the example of how you managed remote learning in the first few weeks, and what did you figure out about yourselves that made it so you were more sort of in tune or in line with that experience as you move through the rest of the school year. That would be a great idea or example. But another great thing is to, again, take a break from COVID-19 for a little bit and talk about, was there something that you picked up, you wanted to do, a topic, a habit, something that, a hobby that you continue to demonstrate that you move through the learning pit? Having something be forced on you like school closures and COVID-19, is very different from something that you volunteer yourself to actually do and get excited about. So,
Allison, I'm sorry, but if you go scroll up there, the other thing go back down where you were, please.
mhm.
Get right there. I'd like to be sure that you pay attention to the idea that often the prompts for your questions come out of the habits. So if you say, what is a different way to look at this problem, what you're really doing is you're asking the students to be thinking flexibly.
Yeah.
So I think that it would be important to go back and also just think about this and recognize that the reason it becomes a habit is because you show them where it is wherever you're using it.
Yes.
So to identify the habits of mind with this would be very valuable.
Absolutely. And if you don't want to do everything all at once, you can start wherever you feel most comfortable. And I think the idea of continuing to use the 4 attributes to grow these ideas, but at the same time, you don't necessarily need to make the 4 attributes visible. You can continue to look at the habits of mind and incorporate that connection, just like you modeled earlier on in our conversation together. At the same time, you can make that hidden or overt as you're starting to get your students acclimated. But the intention is that as we're trying to grow students' capacity in the early weeks of the school year, really trying to get their voice into the conversation as much as possible. So anything that we're suggesting about questions that students can ask themselves is a good way to get the conversation started, as opposed to something that you have to insist upon. Okay, so hopefully that's enough setup in terms of the directions, and we'll leave you for about 15 minutes to engage in this conversation. Please note that you're supposed to copy this blank version first and then paste it underneath group 1. All right, so good to go, and we'll see you on the other side after about 15 minutes. Benna?
So we're hoping that you will be taking action from this. We're really looking forward to seeing all the wonderful things that people do in the fall. So our idea is that you want to apply some learning from this session. Generate ideas and collaborate with others. Consider how you might use this image in your classroom or with your students. How might the image of the learning pit begin to help them to co-create strategies with you? Because the idea is the image of the learning pit basically says, we all fall in, we all try to climb our way out. So there's something that makes us feel like, okay, this mirrors something I've seen before. And now the question is, how do we really use that image to then co-create ways to climb out? And we're suggesting that if your class culture is about personalizing and you're using voice, co-creation, social construction, and self-discovery, if you're also using in relationship to that the habits of mind that you want to name specifically so that they begin to realize these are habits that they can develop, then we'd say that we think that you're doing a wonderful job regardless of whether you're together, whether you're in hybrid, whether you're in remote, because what you're really doing is providing a great opportunity for learning. So we so appreciate being with you, and we wish you much good luck for the fall.
And I know that you guys are enjoying this session in an asynchronous manner. So you're doing this potentially throughout your summertime. And so we wanted to reach out and say that we do want to stay connected to you. So if you want to continue to peruse the Habits of Mind site or the Learning Personalized site, or you want to reach out to us personally on Twitter or on email. But again, we look forward to hearing from you. And again, thank you so much for spending a small part of your summer with us.